We are back talking vintage sports from the old garden on 48th Street in New York City. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We've got a panel of great folks, regulars. Hal Bock is here. Hal Bock?
Good evening, Hal. Hi, I'm here.
How are you?
Good, I'm doing well.
All right, and we have George Case the third is a regular on this show.
Always enjoy talking to everybody. Hal, good to talk to you.
Beautiful.
Absolutely, George. The same here.
And we have a new regular. He's David Hubler, and David and Hal go way back. David and George go way back. And we're delighted to have you, David Hubler.
Hi, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here.
David.
Hi.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And our guest today is a returnee to these airwaves for like the billionth time. He's my godfather on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. He does what I do on the West Coast. He does it on the East Coast. He has a show out of Connecticut, and he's Tony De Angelo. How are you?
I am fine, and good evening to everyone. This is going to be fun.
Yep, good evening there, Tony.
Yeah, hi.
We have a bunch of panels going on the network, and George and Tony have an incomplete conversation going about the defensive backfield of the Giants and the shoe situation. So let's pick it off with what you guys were talking about, Tony, and I'd like you to elaborate on some thoughts that you were...
yeah, I have actually, I would like for George to record this for the record because I was telling it to Bob Lazari and he couldn't believe it. Could you tell me or tell us all the story of when you were selling sneakers and John Wooden and Henry Bibby, and it just brings us back to a time that I find it heartwarming compared to what's happening today, and I really would appreciate it.
I'll tell you what, Tony, I talked to Ralph about it. I mentioned it, and a couple of weeks ago we had Henry on, and he remembered the situation. But when I was in the athletic footwear business many, many years ago, I was working for Pro Keds at the time, and we were introducing a new basketball shoe. And I was looking for some exposure. I was trying to get the shoe placed on some, players of prominence. And I sent a letter to Coach Wooden because he was in the middle of his, many, many national championships. UCLA was at the very top of the list when it comes to college programs. And Coach Wooden wrote back to me and said that he'd be happy to place a pair of our new shoe on Henry Bibby and see if Henry likes him. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, cover shot of Sports Illustrated, our new basketball shoe is being worn by Henry Bibby. And my co-workers were amazed. They said, "How in the world did you do that?" And I said, "Well, I really wrote to Coach Wooden, and he responded. And Henry loved the shoe and put it on and wore it. And then Henry told me that he wore it many times during his NBA career." So people were asking me, well, my Lord, how did you do that? And I said, well, it really cost me a postage stamp. That's what it is. And Tony, as you talk about the shoe scandals today, when you're talking millions and millions of dollars, I mean, this was in the early days. This was in the mid-'70s, and Coach Wooden, I happened to have lunch with him at a NCAA Final Four tournament a few years later, and Billy Packer, who was the announcer for CBS, I think, on the college Final Four. Billy was a personal friend of Coach Wooden and a personal friend of mine. He arranged lunch. I went to the luncheon expecting to talk basketball. And Coach Wooden said to me right off the bat, he said, "You know what?" He said, "I remember the letter you sent me, and I remember that I thought to myself, I wonder if you're related to George Case, the ball player. Because I was a baseball fan, and I loved your father. I thought he was a terrific player. And I just happened to, when I saw your name, I said, there's got to be a connection." So that's how it all started, and I was very pleased with the outcome. and I always had fond memories of Coach Wooden, and Henry Bibby was turned out to be a real fine NBA player, and was captain of the UCLA basketball team his senior year.
Thank you.
All right. Tony, you talked about your association, basically because you're from the same town, Andy Robustelli, back in those days. And I want to get the impression of David Hubler of the defensive line. You haven't had a voice on this, and I like your memories of that Robustelli, Greer, Cabbage, and Modulewski defensive line. Just off the top of your head.
It's definitely off the top of my head. I remember them, and I remember the teams of that era because it was one of the few times that I really followed NFL, and the Giants in particular. What I loved about the NFL in those days was that when I was in high school, you could get a ticket for 50 cents to go to Yankee Stadium and see them play. If you got there early enough, if you remember what the old Yankee Stadium looked like, there were two bullpens, one out in right field and one in left field. Well, if you sat right at the edge of the right field bullpen, you were literally on the 40-yard line. So for 50 cents, you had tickets to see the Giants play, and of course that was the era when the four horsemen, let's say, the defense were there, and Tittle was quarterbacking, and they had really good teams in that era, and of course they played the Browns nose to nose every year. I remember the defense there too was the only one they couldn't stop, of course, was Jimmy Brown. I mean, Brown ran through them like crazy. But they played such tremendously tough games.
And they had the violent world, they called it the violent world of Sam Huff.
Sam Huff, right. Mm-hmm.
Who played Brown as well as any middle linebacker going. No one really had success stopping him.
No, he's so strong.
Oh, he was a bull. Hal mentioned before that it was like his third best sport. He's a Syracuse guy. Hal, you sent your kid to Syracuse. What is the legend up there where it's real cold?
And don't forget, they play now in the Carrier Dome, which is, of course, a dome stadium. But in those days, they played in an open stadium in the middle of the winter. It had to be brutal. But Jim Brown is a legend in Syracuse without question. His number was retired, 32, as was 44, which is another story for Syracuse athletics. But I always like to say my son and my money went to Syracuse.
Well, I have a story about Jim Brown playing, because he was a tremendous lacrosse player, and in addition to football, of course. And my good friend's brother was at Dartmouth at the time, and Dartmouth was playing Syracuse up in Hanover. And the Dartmouth team came out on the field, and the Syracuse team came out on the field, and they looked at Brown, and they protested to the referee, to the officials, that he was wearing shoulder pads. Well, they made him take off his shirt. And, of course, he was not wearing shoulder pads. That was Jim Brown.
And that's a great story. David, that's a great story. And Hal and I have talked about it. And I was at Rutgers when Jimmy Brown was there at Syracuse. And Rutgers always had a terrific lacrosse team. But, Syracuse was at the very top. And Jimmy Brown has been recognized as possibly the finest lacrosse player ever to play the game in the United States. Just an incredible, talented athlete in both, football, obviously, and in lacrosse.
Mm-hmm. I understand from my friend in Bridgeport, who is a fanatical autograph collector, his goal was to get every single New York Yankee signature from every Yankee who had played in the 20th century. I actually was able to help him out on one because years ago I was doing some work for the estate of Richard Kettelbach, who had actually I think he was with the Senators after your dad, George. So I had a copy of his will.
Right. Okay.
But anyway, he said that out of all the people, he has like horrible stories to tell about people whom, honestly, you'd be surprised. But he said one of the nicest people on the autograph line, most complimentary, most kind, most gentle, was Jim Brown. I mean, not at all like his movie character.
Right.
Or his,
well, Tony, you mentioned that about autographs. As I know, and I've seen many players. Some players will gladly sign. Other players will refuse to sign and really will, turn off a lot of young kids. And then in the later years, it's become sort of a racket because if they were going to be paid for their autograph, they would sign. If they weren't going to be paid, they wouldn't sign. So,
I'll tell you a little story about autographs. I've got a story about autographs.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had occasion to interview the great Bill Russell, which was another very memorable, like a 2-hour luncheon we had, and it was absolutely sensational. Now, Bill Russell is 6'11" or 7 foot tall, right?
Yeah.
Easily recognizable if you're a sports fan. And we're sitting in this hotel dining room, and the guy at the next table realizes that I'm talking to Bill Russell. So he walks over to Russell, and he says, Mr. Russell, I've always admired you as a player, and would you sign my newspaper? And Russell looked at him, and he said, no, but I'll shake your hand. Russell refused to sign. He was not a guy who signed autographs.
Right.
Now, I'm proud to say that he signed a book for me, because I said, we're not leaving this table until you sign. But he was very
Hal, what you're talking about with Russell, I had heard a similar story, and, he just wouldn't sign. It was just his thing about not signing autographs. On the other hand, you had other players. I know Cal Ripken, when he was, the great player for Baltimore, I mean, when he was going through, going after Gehrig's streak and all that, I mean, from what I was told, he would stay on the field until the last, young person who wanted his autograph, was taken care of. So there are both sides of the spectrum. And on the other hand, I've also heard many stories from parents, fathers in particular. They would be, talking to their son and say, hey, there's so-and-so, run up and get his autograph. The kid would have stars in his eyes, run up there, and all of a sudden the player would just brush him off. So, I mean, there's both sides of the fence when it comes to autographs. Some players will sign readily. I know when my dad was playing, and not to bring, his name into it, except that I remember distinctly, we would be having dinner somewhere, my mother, my dad, myself, and a fan would come up to him and interrupt him at dinner, and my dad used to politely say, I'll be very happy to sign, but would you please, let us have dinner with my family, and then I'll sign. So that's a real world situation that a lot of athletes will face during their their careers.
It's a funny world in the sense that I've got a little local dirt, if you will, to share on Hammer and Hank. And this is going back about, I'd say maybe 30 years ago. A very good friend of mine at the time was the president of the Quinnipiac Club, which is one of these like old dinosaur dinner clubs with a bowling alley in the basement, sort of like a double-A downtown athletic club. And I know Hal knows exactly what I'm talking about. These days they're just white elephants. Nobody goes anymore. But anyway, Henry came into town. He was doing some lectures at Yale, part of the Master Series. And they asked, and typically what the Quinnipiac Club will do in their, 1950s decor is house these heads of state as they come into Yale because nobody sees them. It's sort of a dead part of the street. So they called up my then friend, who was the president, and said, would you be willing to, sponsor Henry, because they have to put everybody on a tab. He said, but, Henry will pay when he's done. He said, well, it's an honor. He's a Hall of Famer. I'd love to. So here's Henry. He's there every night. He's doing cracked crab. He's doing lobster. He's signing bats. He's signing balls. He's posing for pictures. He's doing his lectures. And one morning, Henry just gets up, packs all his clothes, calls a cab, and leaves and sticks my friend for an $8,000 bill. And whenever I mentioned him, it's Henry Aaron, son of bitches.
Well, that's,
oh wow!
But I think George, I think the whole thing is like, I think that's how these guys are. They never pay for anything.
Yeah, well, that had been the case, Tony. I know a lot of athletes, and I remember going around and doing some basketball clinics, and one of the NBA players who was working with the company I was representing at the time, said to me, he said, I don't know how much I really make, but whenever I do an appearance, the sporting goods store, they're falling over themselves to give me whatever I want for free. So, I certainly understand, what happened there with Henry Aaron, and that's a fact of life when it comes to professional athletes.
For sure.
Here's a question. Which do you think is better, an athlete who doesn't sign an autograph, or a lot of them today who will scribble something that is totally illegible?
Yeah, well, you know what,
anything
David,
like the name.
When you mention that, I've seen on Facebook, somebody will put up a baseball and they'll put a question, well, who signed it?
Yes.
And I can only tell you that when my dad was playing and in the 50s and 60s, players used to sign in ink and they would, be very legible with their penmanship and you could really tell who the players were. Today, a lot of them will scribble in a Sharpie pen and, the next day you'll have no idea who signed that ball.
Yeah, the reason I mention it is I was watching an old ESPN documentary about Babe Ruth the other day. It's about a 50-minute piece. And, he was flooded with kids, and he would stand there, and he every word, every letter of Babe Ruth was clearly visible. He just, so I'm just a little soured on today's autographs.
Yeah. Well,
some players, some players would say, and I've heard this, they'll say, well, I'm not going to give an autograph to somebody who then will take my autograph and sell it. And that's what a lot of players don't like. So that's why some of them, I think, they'll in defense of them, they'll just scribble something that really will be meaningless to anybody. Say, hey, I've got an autograph of Joe Blow. They have no idea who it was, so how are they going to resell that? But if it's a ball or a glove or some piece of paper that was signed by a player legibly, then, they could certainly resell that autograph. On the other hand, I personally have seen many, many autographs, so-called autographs, that are forgeries. Mm-hmm. And the fact I've told people over and over again, I said, you know what, if you go to a card show or you go to a ballpark and somebody signs that for you and you personally saw them do that and they handed it to you, then that's fine. But if somebody says, hey, look, I've got a certificate of authenticity and this is a baseball signed by somebody, that's not worth a piece of paper that it's written on.
Sometimes the certificate of authenticity is forged.
Absolutely.
That's it, yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you another autograph story. I've got another autograph story for you guys.
Please.
I was invited to accompany Muhammad Ali to a book signing. We're going to get in the car at the Waldorf Astoria, and we're going to drive down to Wall Street, where he's going to sign books. Now, this was at the latter part of his life, and he was having trouble communicating. And I did the best I could to interview him in the car, got him to, kind of nod yes, nod no, and so forth. And I had enough for a story. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't collect autographs. I just felt that it was kind of unprofessional. I wouldn't go up to an athlete and ask for an autograph. But Muhammad Ali was Muhammad Ali. So now we get to Wall Street, and we get down to one of these narrow streets down in the financial district in New York. And the street is packed with people waiting for Ali to arrive. He's going to sign books. And I said, you know what, folks? We're not getting out of the car until Muhammad signs a book for me. Now, he doesn't know me from Adam. I'm just a face in the crowd. I covered a number of his fights. with a lot of other people. So he really doesn't know me, but he looks at me and he nods his head and he takes a book and he writes, "To Hal, my pal, Muhammad Ali." And it's one of my treasured possessions.
Oh, wow. Yeah, good story.
That's wonderful,
Wow.
Hal. Very nice story.
Hal, I'm not going to play Can You Top This because you really can't. But I'm going to tell my Bill Russell autograph story.
Okay.
I'm like 14 years old. The Knicks are playing the Celtics, and I'm an autograph collector. I'd go down to the Biltmore and/or the Roosevelt Hotel where the players would stay, and kind of befriend them and maybe accompany them on the walk to the garden from the hotel. And I fall into step with Bill Russell and Wayne Embry walking side by side.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I didn't have a chance in hell to get an autograph unless I made him laugh, which is all I was trained to do, being a high school student in New York.
I get that.
You got to get that. So I go, and there's a story that Bill Russell, before every game, because he had a nervous thing, he would throw up before the game.
Yeah.
And I knew that story as I read that story, and I did know that the Knicks were playing with their center that night was Charlie Tyree. Now, I was a big Knick fan and a realist, and I really knew Tyree's ability. And so I fall into step with Russell. I said, Mr. Russell, I know you're in a hurry to get to the game, but you don't have to be in a hurry tonight because I know you're not going to be nervous, and there'll be no throwing up because you're playing Charlie Tyree and nothing to worry about. And he looks at me and cackles. He gives that Bill Russell cackle. I'm just babbling at him, and I have a picture from Sport magazine. It was of Bill Russell taking a hook shot with his elbow in Dolph Shays' face. And Dolph Shays, Jew boy from Syracuse.
Yes.
So I said, I'm just babbling, but could you sign this? Look, you have your elbow in his face. That's offense. You should be called for that. And he's cackling at me. And he says, give me the piece of it. Give it to me. And he starts to write. And I said, Mr. Russell, could you sign it to Ralph, please? That's what I said. I have the gall to answer. So he looks at me and he signs it to Ralph. And I had a friend decoupage that, or probably reduced it in value, but I'll never sell it anyway. It's decoupage in a beautiful piece of wood. I still have it to this day. Reminded me of the story. You said you'd never sell that autograph, Hal Bock, of Muhammad Ali, any more than I'd sell the autograph of Bill Russell. But getting that Bill Russell laugh out of him is the memory, not so much the autograph, but that human contact.
Right.
And George, I couldn't agree with you more. If you did not see the autograph being signed, consider it to be a forgery in today's day and age.
Well, I just feel, first of all, Ralph, that's a great story about Russell, and that has to be a very rare autograph because, my understanding, I think Hal and Tony.
He didn't sign for
David,
Sat Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, they just did very little signing, but the fact is, and his cackle, you mentioned his cackle. I mean, that's a trademark of Russell. Was his great laugh, and I know for a fact, and I've seen it. There's so many autographs that are being sold on eBay or some of these auction houses, and they're commanding huge amounts of money. And to me, it's great. You say, hey, I've got Babe Ruth's autograph. Wonderful. But I've seen Babe Ruth's autograph in a Sharpie pen, and Sharpie pens were not even invented when Babe Ruth was alive. So, I mean, that's how, or I've seen Babe Ruth's autograph on a National League baseball Well, his autograph should be on an American League baseball. That's where he played.
Well, National League ball signed by Bill White is the really galling.
Yeah, well, when Babe Ruth was playing, it was either William Harridge or one of those that was the president of the American League, or possibly the last year when he was playing for the Boston Braves, it could have been on a National League ball. Or if a signature is of a player after he has either played or at the end of his life or whatever, it carries a lot less value to an autograph collector than an autograph that was signed by the player while he was playing. And that's what I also caution people. I said, to me, if you had the autograph, you saw it, you whenever it was, that's fine. But if it was either at an autograph show or something else, it doesn't carry the same value, sentimental value, monetary value as the autograph of the player when he was playing.
I have speaking of which, I have a nice autograph story, and I have a not-so-nice autograph story. And after this, I'll keep my yap shut. But probably the nicest autograph story I have is went to a Met game about, I think it was 1971. The last batter up in the game was Bob Aspromonte. Of course, who's Bob Aspromonte? We know who Bob Aspromonte is, but nobody else besides us knows. And I think Gil had him on the team because he was kind of Gil's boy, and I think he was giving him a roster spot. Well, Bob ends the game striking out on 3 pitches. So we're walking out and, kind of dawdling, listening to Jane Jarvis, the Queen of Melody, play beautiful organ music. We come down to the parking lot, and then a Met player comes out, and he's signing autographs. And he's signing, like, who is that? And somebody says, well, that's Bob Aspromonte. I'm thinking, now this guy, struck out to end the game. I mean, I'd be denting cars for crying out loud if that were me. And then everybody signs, and I'm just watching him sign. And he looks at me and says, son, may I sign your program for you? I thought, oh, sure. And I handed him my program, and he signed it. He says, thanks very much. Thanks for coming to see me play. And I thought, gee, what a nice man. And I guess he's still alive. I would love to tell him that story, and I hope maybe he's listening to this.
Well, that's a wonderful story, Tony. Now, what's the bad story you're going to tell about?
Number 5, Joe D.
Right. Okay.
Joe D, who would not sign any picture with Marilyn Monroe in it. And people would try to get very clever with Joe D, and they'd walk up to Joe, and they'd have a piece of paper where Marilyn was, and he would just take the thing and start cursing him out.
Right.
But one thing about Joe is he would not sign a round object of any sort. So my friend, the autograph collector, came up to Joe with a doily of a baseball, a round doily, flat. Mm-hmm. And Joe, who at this time is probably about a year before his death, he's like hunched over, he's got glasses, his cheeks are ruddy, he's in a camel hair coat, and he signs it. My friend looks at him and says, hey, I got you to sign a round object. Joe starts cursing. It's like, son of a...
That's a beauty. That's a great
I'll tell
story.
you can't beat these stories. They're terrific. I'm sorry.
I want you to, before we close out, Tony, I want you to complete your, you were on and talking about Andy Robustelli, and we didn't do justice.
Well, George had asked me the question about what
stuff.
Yeah, and George had asked me the question of kind of like what it was like. Now, I was a small boy at that time, and a couple of things I can tell you was that Andy living in Stamford was, well, I mean, he was Mr. Robustelli to us peons, but you would see him like at the grocery store or, perhaps at a high school game, or he was a very, very, very frequent speaker at banquets and had a huge sporting goods business. I mean, I was reading before we came on about the 1956 championship game, which was known as the sneaker game, and they had played in the ice in Yankee Stadium. The sneakers came courtesy of Andy Robustelli, who saw it was going to be icy that day, so he brought in boxes of sneakers for his teammates to play with, and they had much better footing. I mean, he was really, just a very complex guy, into a lot of businesses, very entertaining, and I mean, I knew his son Bob. Rick was older than I was, and what can you really say about him? He really was his executive career in football was nowhere near his playing career. That's really the sad thing.
Right.
But,
Tony, let me ask you one thing. Let me ask you one thing about Robustelli. I'm curious. When he would do a personal appearance or whatever up in Connecticut, would he bring some of the, cabbage and mojo? Would they come with him?
Oh, yeah. I can tell you that when we as a family had moved back into Stamford, Connecticut in 1961, my father worked, actually, another long story for another long time, but my father, several of my uncles and several of my cousins worked in the backstage business in Broadway. If you have absolutely nothing to do and you're watching one of those old All in the Family episodes from the mid to late 1970s, you'll see the lighting director is a gentleman by the name of Tony Cestare, Cestare. Well, Tony would be my first cousin. We were both named after the same uncle. This was the business they were in. But all of that said, with Andy, he would oftentimes he would bring other players. Oh, yeah, right. We're getting to us moving to Stamford, Connecticut. So moving to Stamford, Connecticut, in our apartment complex, there were a number of the Giant families that were actually living there. Andy had got them apartments. The Cabbages lived there. The Moduleskis lived there. The Giffords even lived there. Of course, this was Gifford, the football player, not Gifford, the multinational celebrity. And, they would be seen constantly with their families, with their wives, going to the store. And, they would go to, I think where Andy was really good with these guys was he would take them to where they could make a few bucks in an appearance. He would do punt, pass, and kick, bring a couple of Giants rookies. And, he was always, he looked after players in that regard. But, yes, he certainly did do that.
Right. No, I was curious because, over the years when players like, with the Giants, those great linemen, but I know that, we're on the anniversary of Bobby Thompson's home run against the Dodgers and Ralph Branca. And I know that Branca and Bobby Thompson used to do a lot of appearances together. And then also, my personal friend who I played high school basketball and baseball against him, Al Downing, gave up Hank Aaron's number 715.
Yes, right.
And Hank Aaron and Al Downing do a lot of personal appearances together. So that was the reason I asked you about that, Tony, because I know a little bit of the history of those kind of events, and I would think with the great Giants defensive linemen that the three or four of them together would be a tremendous attraction.
Downing was with the Dodgers at the time, wasn't he? He had been with the Yankees, and they.
Yes.
Hey guys, we're running short, so I'm going to mention a New York Giant, a defensive back, and I'll start with Hal Bock off the top of your head. Give me your reaction, Emlyn Tunnell.
What a terrific player. He really was a leader on that team, and that's unusual for a defensive back. But he was a terrific player and a great leader on that team. He also played for the Packers, I believe, and I think he's in the Hall of Fame. If he's not, he ought to be. He was a great defensive back, terrific player.
Died early too.
Yes, died too early.
That was the era where they were just beginning to shift over from playing on both sides of the ball to actually having a separate defense and offense. Just around that time, the late 50s.
Yeah, more so even the early 50s, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I want to ask George, you weren't a New Yorker, but that name was big all over football. Your thoughts about Emlen Tunnell?
Well, my thoughts of Emlen Tunnell, and it's funny you mentioned that, and my good friend Jim Van Koski, who has the Delaware County Sports Hall of Fame and worked with me and on the DVD, Ball Field to Battlefield and Back from FDR to JFK. But Emlen Tunnell was from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, which is in Delaware County. And, Jim Van Koski just recently had an exhibit of all of Emlen Tunnell's football paraphernalia. So, my familiarity with the name, obviously I saw Emlen Tunnell playing, but currently, there is a display in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, where he grew up of all his football memorabilia. So he was an absolutely great player. And, I know that along with, Gifford and Y.A. Tittle and the great, defensive line, Emlen Tunnell, certainly was one of the major stars for those New York Giants.
Beautiful. Okay, Tony, take her away.
Emlen Tunnell, when I think of him, I think of him as the defensive backfield coach, Emlen's Gremlins. And
yes.
Actually when somebody made a tackle or picked off a pass or something, it was Emlen's doing fine work with the Gremlins, and that was my recollection of Emlen Tunnell. I'm a little young to remember him as a player, but I certainly remember him as a coach.
Beautiful. Now, I'm going to go around the room again. The name of podcast radio is Selfless Self-Promotion. So I'll start with Hal Bock. What do you want to say? What do you tell us about a book? Where to get it? Tell us about your column, how we can get your weekly column. You're staying in the game in semi-retirement.
Well, I'm trying to keep my brain active. Sometimes it's a challenge.
Yes, absolutely. That's what all of this is about.
My latest book, as you guys know, is Banned Baseball's Blacklist of All-Stars and Also-Rans. It's available from Diversion Books and also on Amazon. And it was a fun read, and it's a fun read, and it was fun to write and to research. And I think folks will enjoy it. It's a great stocking stuffer for the holidays, I think. That's my book. And as far as the column goes, I write a weekly column called Box Score, which is what I used to write for the Associated Press. And that appears on a website called New York Sports Day, NY Sports Day. And it's a fun ride. I enjoy doing that, and it keeps me writing, which is what I love to do.
And you continue to honor your dad, whose idea of Box Score.
He came up with that, and that's the main reason why I want to keep it alive, because he was the one who originated that, and I thought it was a terrific idea, and I ran with it, and it's been part of the sports landscape, you might say, for 40, 50 years. So.
Okay, now, George, tell us where we can get your wonderful DVD that you mentioned a few moments ago.
Okay, well, thank you. And my DVD is called Ball Field to Battlefield and Back from FDR to JFK, and it's about a 60-minute DVD in full color with narration provided by my dad and Mickey Vernon. And it was really 8mm color home movies that my dad and Mickey took during their playing career. So it's not game action. It's behind the scenes, batting practice, train trips, promotions, pregame, spring training with some of the great players. About 40 future Hall of Famers are in that, from Ted Williams to Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, Hank Greenberg, and it's really a look back in Major League Baseball history during World War II. And it's available. The interest has been tremendous, and my website is www.timelessbaseball.com, and it has all the DVD information and the background on baseball during World War II.
Beautiful. David Hubler.
Hey, I'm up fourth, batting fourth. Okay.
Batting number 4.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was very happy to provide a lot of information to David for what he's going to talk about. It's just a wonderful book.
Yes, and I was going to say thank you once again for that, George, because it was invaluable information, real insider stuff. The book is called The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball in the Nation's Capital Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. From Roman and Littlefield Publishers. It came out in paperback this spring with a special banner head on the cover commemorating the 70th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's first appearance with the Dodgers. Because the book does end with Jackie Robinson going to Montreal, and then there's a brief mention of him in the 47, because the book covers the years 41 to 45 primarily. The end of 45 is when Robinson was signed, and then 46 he played up in Montreal. So it covers the history of the game from a DC perspective, which to many people do not know was really the nexus of Major League Baseball during the war, primarily because of Clark Griffith and his close association with President Roosevelt. And so many things that were instituted, like a lot of ladies' nights and double headers and games under the lights. Griffith was one of the main sponsors of these kind of events, including a lot of charity events to raise money for the the Army and Navy War Fund during the war. And George, was it during the war that your dad ran against Jesse Owens? I think it was.
Yeah, it was. It was right after, in 1946. And that's when my dad ran against Jesse. Before that, my dad had races against a lot of major league players and never lost. And then when my dad went to Cleveland, Bill Beck said, George, I want to match you up with Jesse Owens. We'll have a great promotion, the fastest man in the world against the fastest man in baseball. And that's where it came from. So, yeah, I appreciate that, David. It was in 1946 at Cleveland Stadium. Jesse ran the 100-yard dash in a baseball uniform across the outfield grass in 9.9 seconds and just beat my dad, who ran next to him in a baseball uniform in 10 seconds flat. So it was quite an honor for my dad to run against Jesse, and one that he always remembered as one of the highlights of his career.
Yeah, well, your dad features prominently in the Nats and the Grays, and I was glad to see his name up there on the facade at Nats Park this past Sunday when I went.
Yeah, well, thank you. You know what? And somebody had asked me about that day where you mentioned. They said, well, there's the Hall of the Washington D.C. Hall of Stars. I said, yeah, well, that's what my dad was elected to, which was more than just baseball. It was baseball, football, basketball, hockey. All the great players in those sports were honored by the D.C. Hall of Stars, and that's, the display is at Nationals Park in Washington.
And Shirley Povich and some sports writers are in there too.
Absolutely, and Shirley is there, and certainly, well-deserved honor. He's probably one of the most well-known and widely respected sports writers of all time. And Hal, I'm sure Hal has many stories and knows of the reputation of Shirley Povich.
I keep trying. We're trying to get Maury Povich on. His producers are very tough to go between, and I'd love to have Maury talk about his memories of his dad.
Yeah, and I can tell you, Ralph, if Shirley was still alive, I bet it'd be a lot easier to get Shirley on. He was very accommodating and just a very, very nice person.
Well, I'm not saying Maury isn't. I'm just
saying, I know, but I'm saying the access to Shirley is very easy.
Today's day and age.
Yeah. Well, I can vouch for what George just said, because when I was researching the book, when I first started several years ago, of course, and I went to Povich because he'd started with the old Washington team as a rookie sports writer the year they won the World Series. And he said, oh, yeah, come on up to the apartment and we can talk. So I went up to his apartment, and we spent a good hour and a half talking baseball, and he allowed me to record it, and some of the material found its way into the book.
Right. Wow. I have a confession to make, and this concerns George and his father.
Yes, my son.
1947, I discovered baseball. I was 8 years old. My father took me to my first game, and I fell in love with the game, and I remain in love with the game today. Now, if you're in love with the game and you're 8 years old, what do? You collect baseball cards, right?
Right.
So I go and I start buying baseball cards, which, of course, my mother threw out, but that's another story for another day. Right. And among the early cards that I got was a picture of George Case Jr. sliding across home plate. This is 1947, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, who is George Case Jr.?
Right.
I never heard of him because his career really was before I got to the game.
Uh-huh. Yeah, my dad retired in 47, right?
Yeah, so I had no idea who I was dealing with here. And I was smart enough, at least at that age, to do a little research. I looked around and I tried to find out who George, because I wanted some value in my cards. You know, I didn't want nobodies. I wanted people who I could recognize.
I appreciate that, Hal. That was very nice of you.
That's how I found out about George Case Jr. because I really went to work and I had to do some high-level research at age 8 to find out who George Case Jr. was.
Well,
one quick story. I know you're pressed for time, but one quick story about Shirley Povich, and I mentioned this earlier to Ralph. When my dad was inducted into the D.C. Hall of Stars in 1989, he was told that he was going to be inducted before he passed away, and then he passed away, and I was able to accept the honor for him. But Shirley Povich called me personally and said, George, I would like to induct your dad into the Hall of Stars if that's okay with you. And I thought to myself, okay with me? I mean, that's quite an honor to have somebody the stature of Shirley Povich wanting to personally induct, your father into the D.C. Hall of Stars. I was absolutely thrilled, as was our entire family.
That's a great story.
Hey, George, your dad raced Jesse Owens. My dad raced Bob Moskowitz to the deli at Kansas. And I know it didn't get as much publicity, but back in those days, the Smoggy, that was to die for. So, Tony De Angelo, tell us about the show you do with Bob Lazari. And,
I'm listening to you guys, and I feel like a hootenanny player between hoots. The Monday Night Sports Show, which Bob and I started doing, and let me see, that would have been 2008. That's actually going to be winding up this December, and it's been a good 10 years of, talking to people whom I read about and actually brought me to a place where I could be here with you guys tonight. We started to share about our mutual work, and that's really been the great part of the journey, and we've talked to tremendous people. We've been stiffed by a number of them. Every time I was a great Monkees fan growing up. I loved the Monkees. Well, Peter Tork, who does not live far from me.
Are you being dubbed right now, Tony? Is this the real Tony De Angelo, or is your voice being dubbed?
No, this is the real Tony.
Okay, because the Monkees always had their stuff dubbed, so I was wondering.
Well, we'll put it this way. I mean, I could say a whole lot worse about Peter Tork, who one night said, I'm going to come in and I'm going to do a show with you guys live for an hour, and we're waiting, and Peter never showed up, and he stiffed us, so whenever I hear Monkees music these days, I have to turn it off. Shame on you, Peter. I mean, Marcia Brady on the Brady Bunch got Davy Jones to show up, but Peter Tork stiffed me.
Okay. Tony, how do we get to the show if your listeners out there want to?
Well, the Monday Night Sports archives are on YouTube at Monday Night Sports 14. the Tony De Angelo PM Coast to Coast, the interviews that have been done in the past, Hal among them. Very grateful to have Al. That is also on YouTube. You could do a search. It pops right up. However, I'm in the process now of doing some retooling of actually going to an audio format, which really would be a whole lot easier for me to do administratively. The video is a wonderful thing to do when everything goes off, but it is such a dancing bear act to get everybody.
Well, if you're ever looking for a station to just do the audio on, you got it right here at the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
Well, thank you very much, and that is very grateful. I am very grateful of you, very gracious of you. But
well, that's a long-term
offer,
and that's been going on for a long time. We'll make that happen pretty soon, Tony.
Well,
love you, my friend, and thank you for being here, David Hubler. You made your debut as a regular.
Yes,
debut.
I'm thrilled.
Yes, you told me something the other day that you preceded Hal Bock.
No, I followed him. Hal was sports editor of the NYU Square Journal.
Hey, why? I was editor-in-chief.
Yes, but you had been sports editor prior to that, and I followed you.
I wrote sports.
Yeah. I followed
you. How many years ago was this, gentleman?
A lot.
A lot, yeah, that's right, a lot.
I graduated in 63.
I graduated in 61.
Right. You were 2 years ahead of me, and I actually was co-editor-in-chief my senior year there, too.
There you go.
So I followed you there, too.
Okay.
In the name of Cal Ramsey, something's going right.
Yeah.
Right.
He was the first athlete I met at lunch, and he said, "Could you mind if I sit down?" And there was Cal Ramsey coming to sit at my table in the cafeteria. I was just a freshman, and it was like, wow, you know.
Cal and Bob Wolf used
cool.
to do the Knick games when I was in high school on Channel 9 in New York. It was a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah.
Wow. You guys remember Bud Palmer doing the Knick games?
Sure.
Right.
Now, many people think he's been credited with the jump shot. I don't know how true that is, but you look it up and they say Bud Palmer was the first. You know, when he was with the Knicks.
Good.
Bud was on the Wide World
to be
Sports when I was
continued.
growing up.
What's that?
Bud was on the Wide World of Sports growing up. He would back up Cosell. And he was, I think, like after 1970, he disappeared. And, you know, Hal probably can verify this. I think he went to work for the Lindsay administration in New York, if I recall, as commissioner or something
but
or other.
I can't swear to it. But that does, in the recesses of what passes for my brain these days, that does sound somewhat familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he broadcast.
Imagine going from Howard Cosell to John Lindsay. I can't imagine it.
Okay, guys, next time you come back, Tony, you'll talk more about Howard. And this has been terrific as usual. Next week, we'll do it again, guys. To those of you out there.
And an honor and a pleasure.
Okay.
Looking forward to it. I always enjoy it.
If you enjoyed our offering, the audience, I want you to consider accumulating lightly used children's books and put them in a big box, donate them to the Head Start program. So anybody that likes this stuff, if you get in the habit of taking books to the Head Start program, you got to start somewhere to make this a better world, and through the kids is where it's at. So
for sure.
I enjoyed doing
Ralph.
this with you guys.
It's very, very worthwhile. Terrific.
Beautiful. We're going to do that on every show. We're just going to remind people that if they'd like to do it, couldn't think of a better cause out there, and money doesn't exchange hands, and that makes it nice. So take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Right. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.
And keep on keeping on. Adios.